Part 2, or Chapter 2, Section 2, Bon Voyage. Before Hamilton and I set out on the final journey, we took several practice voyages, and each one was disastrous in regards to seamanship and companionship. If I hadn't been so spellbound by the thought of $10,000 in cash, I would have fled with the rats the moment the rust-colored sails were hoisted. But it was obvious that we didn't so much arrive at our destination as aim and crash into them like kamikaze yachtsmen. On our first practice run, we couldn't even get out of the harbor without shaming ourselves in front of the entire boat community. We were in high spirits when we set off, so we had the Beaver in full sail, the main and the mizzen and the jib smartly trimmed for all to see as we lumbered towards the channel through the reef, which outlined the harbor. I was down in the main cabin opening a couple of cold beers for mid-morning toast when a crash and a sudden pitch starboard had me panicked. I could hear the brittle staghorn coral snapping off against our bow as the sail dragged us up and onto the reef. I dropped the beers and scrambled up the ladder to the main deck. Instead of steering between the port and the starboard buoys, marking the deep channel through the reef, Hamilton steered to the outside of the port marker. Now he stood at the wheel and scowled at me as I had charted the course. "Don't just stand there," he barked. "Lower the sails," and I hurried to get them down before we did any further damage to the hull. For all I knew, we would sink. And as I lowered the main, the Neil struck a solid wall of coral heads, and we heaved forward to come to a grinding stop. I flopped awkwardly onto the deck. I'm actually going to put up a picture of all these parts of the boat, because I also don't know much about these. "Idiot," Hamilton shouted. "Get up. You're making a fool of us." "Don't blame me," I snapped. "Don't you dare talk back to the captain," he snapped. "Now get to work." Then he went below and didn't return. "Remember the money," I muttered angrily to myself. The money. When I secured the sails, I began to realize why he ducked out of sight. Boats passed out of the harbor and into the freight, and each one slowed to remark on my sailing gaff and give me advice. It was clear that we had to sit there like wooden carrion until, if we were lucky, high tide would float us off. 4 hours later, it did, and Hamilton returned from below, and I raised the sails. "Take the wheel," Hamilton ordered, and headed for the Buck Island beach. "I'm going to check the hull." Buck Island was a small island just off the northeast coast of St. Croix, and before the racial trouble started, hundreds of tourists sunbathed there, and it was especially popular with scuba divers, who could follow an underwater park trail through the coral on the east side. Now it was mostly deserted. I aimed for the sandy west side. The wind was behind me, and the mainsail was full out, and the boat cruised along. Down below, I could hear Hamilton knocking about, lifting boards, and looking for leaks. It occurred to me that I knew nothing about survival at sea. The only common-sense facts I knew were to get in a life raft, have protection from the sun, and plenty of fresh water, and drink your own urine when you run out of fresh water, because salt water will certainly kill you. My father had thought to teach me this after he had been in a sailing accident and stranded on a life raft for 2 days. When Hamilton emerged, he said the hull was fine and then checked the trim of the sails. He frowned at me as he pulled the main in a bit and tightened the jib. I just kept moving the wheel a little to the left and a little to the right, pretending that my small adjustments actually made a difference. Hamilton stretched out on the deck and closed his eyes. "Wake me up when we get there," he said. I just stared at the huge mainsail and kept the wind behind us. I didn't want it to start luffing on Hamilton would hop up and get after me. In the first few days, we had spent outfitting the Beaver, checking the ropes, repairing the sails, sealing the deck, and he treated me like Billy Budd. I don't know who that is. I couldn't do anything right, and he just glowered at me like Claggart when I made a stupid mistake. I was thinking about what it was going to be like spending a month on board with only him, when suddenly I noticed we were rapidly closing in on an island, and we were still under full sail. Hamilton shouted, "Get up," and I spun the wheel to the hard port and began to lower the main, but it was too late. Our momentum took us directly towards the beach, and we ran aground softly onto the sand. Only the bow was stuck like a knife in a rum cake. A few locals ran toward us, laughing and shaking their heads in disbelief. We were the Keystone Cops of the sea. I waved back to them and grinned. Hamilton was furious. "This is an outrage," he said. "You've made a fool of us again." Then keel haul me, I barked back. Don't tempt me, Hamilton said coldly. Keel hauling is still legal in British Navy. Then he ducked down the hatch, and in a minute the motor started, and he shifted the boat into the reverse. The sea beneath our stern bubbled up, but the screw didn't generate enough torque to pull us out. Finally, one of the idle tourist boats edged up along our stern, and the captain tossed me a lanyard. I tied it to the cleat and he towed us off the beach. Thanks, I shouted when we had been set loose. I untied the lanyard and let it drop to the water. Any time the skipper called back, and I could make out his sly smile as he deftly coiled the rope. 2 days later, we left St. Croix for good, and we set out at night in the calm water with our lights off and followed the channel markers north out of the harbor, past Buck Island and farther towards St. John and Virgin Gorda. When I turned to say goodbye to St. Croix, I could see 2 warehouses burning down at the docks. The white exodus was even more frantic now. Already there we could see the writing on the wall were torching their own property for the insurance money, but before it became worthless. The flames illuminated a small city of wooden crates that had already been packed with personal goods and prepared for shipping. But I was filled with joy and triumph, and the fires to me were the flames of Troy still burning as Odysseus pushed off for Ithaca. I was ready for an adventure. It was not lost on me that so many writers had gone to sea, and for them, setting off across the waters was the same as setting down to fill the pages with their adventures. Before leaving, I had gone to a used bookstore and selected every title I could find, which had something to do with the sea. I had Billy Budd, Martin Eden, Treasure Island, Heart of Darkness, the Odyssey, Robinson Crusoe, and Mutiny on the Bounty trilogy. I was armed with books the way the Navy goes to sea, armed with to the teeth. I figured these books would have to live with me as cabin companions since Hamilton was so snappish. But I didn't mind. I wanted to write while sailing, and I was more than willing to come under the spell of books. All through the first night, Hamilton took the wheel because only he knew where the hash was buried. At dawn, I was asleep in the aft cabin, and when suddenly I was thrown out of my bunk and onto the floor. I could hear Hamilton cursing on the deck. The ropes were slapping the mast, and the boom was tangled in stanchion ropes. I slipped on my top sliders and went up. By then, Hamilton had the gaff and the boom under the control, and I pulled down the jib. What happened? I yelled into the wind. Riptide, he hollered back. Not to worry. Riptide my ass, I thought. I figured he had fallen asleep but wouldn't admit it. And I looked around. We had rolled up against a menacing chain of sharp rocks and stuck out of the ocean like a shark's lower jaw. Hamilton started the engine, and as we backed away, I could see where, in a beautiful spot, it seemed to me to be the most wonderful sight I had ever seen. The rising sun was buttering the clouds, the sea was royal blue, and the dolphins darted in and out of the water, weaving in between the rocks with absolute grace. Finally, I thought, something good has happened. Maybe our luck will change. Off the starboard side, now about 100 yards away, was a small uninhabited island no more than 5 acres. It was made of immense granite slabs, each one the size of a train car, and all piled up as if derailed. In each crack grew a gnarly sea of grape trees deformed from leeward winds, and at the water's edge was a perfect melon slice of a beach, all protected by the outer chains of the sharp rocks. It's called Little Dog Island, Hamilton said. I got us here. Now you get the dinghy and go ashore. Somewhere beneath the stand of trees, you'll find a tarp covered with sand. Under that is the hash. Start bringing it on board, but don't get it wet. Fine, I thought, but inside I was dancing around to a pirate jig. Yo-ho-ho, I sang in my belly, imagining myself as Long John Silver about to put on shore. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil has done the rest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. I never would have made a good pirate like Billy Bones or Black Dog. I didn't have the stamina. I dug up the canvas bag, each weighing about 50 pounds, and dragged them through the sand, loaded 4 at a time in the dinghy, rode through the choppy surf and through the rocks to the Beaver, tied it up, precariously balanced on the dinghy gunwales while heaving each sack on deck. I did this 10 times in a row until finally, when I had finished lugging the 2,000 pounds of hash on board and had hauled up the dinghy and secured it to the cradle, I dropped down onto the deck and lay there as if I had fallen from the top of the mast. I was exhausted. Hamilton had been packing the bag in the fossil in his cabin, and in mine, I wasn't nearly as tired. Grog time, he hollered from down below and rang a brass bell. I forced myself to stand and staggered down the ladder into the main cabin and over the gallery door. Here you go, sailor, he said, suddenly full of good captainly cheer, and then poured me a tumbler of rum and locked the bottle away. I drank it back and asked for more. British Navy rules, he replied. Only 1 grog per day per man. Are you serious? I asked. Sailor, this is serious business, he replied, and underlining each word with his tone. I can't have any drunks on board? Aye, Captain, I said sarcastically. I never did get drunk, but I got after the hash like a mouse at cheese. I nibbled on it each day, a gram here and a gram there, and Hamilton took his hash in his tea the British way. I assumed. He shaved his down to a powder with a straight-edged razor and then dipped a heaping spoonful into a hot cup of water and stirred it with sugar. Stoned out of our minds, we navigated through the long madhouse days of the voyage as if crossing the ocean in a floating sanitarium. I spent hours sitting cross-legged on the deck with a ship's log on my lap, recording the day's events as if I were drifting aboard in Baudelaire's artificial paradise. The ship was a strange floating cell, blue skies, blue ocean, and we weren't locked in, but there was nowhere to go, and aside from the weather, each day unfolded very much the same, bright, blinding, and blue. What changed was the drama on board. Hamilton was insane, or so I thought. He wouldn't talk to me except to order me around or humiliate me in some way. He stopped wearing clothes. He constantly paced the deck in the nude, staring out on the horizon line and stroking his beard. He must have been thinking about something because the moods on his face were as shifty as the clouds overhead, and he whispered things I couldn't even make out. He counted numbers on his fingers as if he were making lists. For hours, he practiced tying and untying knots. At times, he looked at me as if he had never even seen me before. We had 2 bunks, a toilet, a galley, no radio, plenty of books, a deck of cards, a chess set, and 2,000 pounds of hash. After we loaded the hash at Little Dog Island, I began snooping around the boat just to see what else I could find. I lifted the cushion lid and galley bench, and inside were all sorts of sailing gear. Flags for 6 countries, a rusty flare gun, which made me think of Rick's forehead, a fire extinguisher, rain slickers, and a book the size of a dictionary. It was a cloth bound in green linen and embossed in gold. On the cover is the name of the ship. I sat on the galley table and opened this cover, and it was blank. Dozens of pages had been ripped out. The remaining pages were wrinkled and stained from water damage. It smelled salty and a bit like diesel fuel, and I loved it. And I immediately thought it was up to me to record my boat's history, like so many other sea writers had done. And I turned the page, smoothed it out with my hand, and got started.